The year Henry's family faced the brink of bankruptcy, my father arranged a marriage alliance between us, and I married Henry. At the time, I had no idea he already had a childhood sweetheart, Isabella, who was engaged to him. Later, my father became embroiled in a scandal, and his company faced a financial crisis. Meanwhile, Henry brought Isabella back home and announced that he would compensate her with a grand wedding. I didn't cry or create a scene. Instead, I quietly began packing my luggage. Henry sneered at me and said, "Stop playing these petty games of hard to get. Do you still think you're the eldest daughter of the Arya family?" He didn't know that I still kept the divorce agreement he had written while drunk. In 7 days, I planned to leave the country with my father. The day my father was sent to the overseas branch of the company, after stepping down from his position due to a workplace harassment scandal, Henry brought Isabella, now divorced, back home. He came to my room and with an expressionless face said, "Next week I will let Isabella move in. I owe her too much over the years. No matter how you feel, you have to accept it." My father had just left, and Henry couldn't even wait a single day to bring her into our home. I looked up at him, his eyes cold and devoid of any warmth, like an icy winter breeze. After 3 years of marriage, I had never been able to reach his heart. I quickly turned away, hiding the ache in mine. "Okay," I replied. After all, I would be leaving soon, so it didn't matter who he brought home. Henry seemed a little surprised by my response. His lips moved as if to say something, but he stayed silent. He had always been a man of few words when it came to me. After he left, I opened the safe and retrieved the divorce agreement he had written 3 years ago, hidden beneath my jewelry box. It bore his signature and fingerprint. All that remained was a certificate from the Civil Affairs Bureau to sever our ties completely. 3 years ago, at a business dinner, I had fallen for Henry at first sight. His family proposed a marriage just 3 days later. I thought it was destiny until someone informed me that Isabella was getting married that same day. That night, Henry drank heavily. I brought him some sobering soup in his study, where he lay on his desk, eyes red and muttering, "Isabella?" My heart softened as I approached, but he suddenly grabbed a glass and smashed it on the floor. Glass shards flew everywhere, and I stepped back, trembling. The ever-gentle and refined Henry glared at me with gritted teeth. "This is all your fault, Arya. If it weren't for you, if it weren't for your president father, I wouldn't have been forced to marry you. I wouldn't have had to watch Isabella marry someone else." His words were laced with resentment, shattering my belief in our so-called happy marriage. Overcome with anguish, I couldn't stop my tears. Henry staggered to his feet, picked up a pen, and hastily signed and fingerprinted a divorce agreement. He threw the paper at me, saying coldly, "I want to divorce you and bring Isabella home." He was drunk and impulsive. I managed to steady my voice and said, "You're drunk. We'll talk about this when you're sober." Picking up the paper, I left the room. Closing the door behind me, I allowed my tears to fall freely. That night, the cold wind mirrored the chill in my heart. The next morning, Henry returned to his usual polite demeanor, never mentioning Isabella or the divorce again. I pressed the agreement to the bottom of my dressing table, lying to myself that, with Isabella newly married, I still had a chance. But 2 months ago, Henry personally hired the best lawyer to handle Isabella's divorce. Feeling sorry for her, he brought her to live in our city. Now, he wanted her to move into our home. While counting my assets to turn them into cash to help my father's company through its crisis, Henry entered the room with Isabella. He said, "Isabella wants to live in this room. You need to move out." His tone was cold, leaving no room for negotiation. This room, once mine, held memories of our wedding, the flowers on the balcony, the roses he had planted, and the swing from our ceremony. It was the closest room to his bedroom, the one he insisted I move into after our marriage so his late nights wouldn't disturb me. Isabella stood beside him, timidly glancing around with eyes full of envy. I looked up and for the first time refused him. No, the house is big enough. There are plenty of rooms. Why does it have to be this one? Isabella tugged at Henry's sleeve, looking aggrieved. His face darkened. The room felt gloomy because Isabella liked it, and the roses on the balcony, which I thought were planted for me, had actually been meant for her all along. This space, it turned out, had been prepared for Isabella from the very— I stared at her silently, and Henry immediately stepped in to shield her, his tone cold and commanding. Move out today. Be obedient and don't embarrass everyone. Lowering my eyes, I replied softly, Okay. My father had lost his power, and the company was in crisis. I no longer had the support that had once kept Henry polite to me. Before evening, I packed my things and moved into a remote guest room. Later, I took out all the jewelry and designer bags Henry had given me over the years and went to a luxury goods resale store to sell them. I had shopped there often before, so the sales associate greeted me warmly and led me to the VIP room. I placed the items on the table one by one, and my gaze lingered on the diamond ring Henry had given me when he proposed. At that time, he was facing financial difficulties and had used all his savings to buy me that small, delicate ring. The next item was a Cartier bracelet he gifted me after his company went public. Then, there was the Tiffany necklace he gave me as an apology for a drunken mistake. I used to wear it often, and whenever I went to see him, the sparkling crystal pendant would catch the sunlight. He would smile and hug me, saying I was lively and adorable, so different from the reserved women he usually met. The sales associate widened her eyes as she examined the items. These look like gifts from General Manager Henry a few years ago. Are you sure you want to sell them? She asked. I nodded. She carefully assessed everything and gave me a price. I agreed, took the money, and prepared to leave. Just then, I heard Henry's voice from outside, doting and gentle. Do you like this necklace? Isabella's shy voice replied, Yes. Without hesitation, Henry swiped his card to pay for it. When he glanced up and saw me, surprise flickered in his eyes. His gaze fell on my hand, where the diamond ring he had given me was now missing. Henry put down his card and strode over to grab my hand, his eyes locking onto mine. Arya, where's your ring? He demanded. I turned my head to avoid his gaze and lied. I didn't wear it. His expression darkened, and he tightened his grip on my hand, causing me to wince in pain. Isabella quickly intervened, tugging at his wrist. Only then did he seem to snap out of it. Releasing my hand, he smiled at her apologetically, murmuring, I lost my composure. I left quickly under the curious gazes of those around me. 6 days. Before I was scheduled to leave, I was alone in my room organizing documents when my mother-in-law called me over. She insisted I move out of Henry's house immediately. I declined politely, making up an excuse about having unfinished tasks. Her expression turned sour as she snapped, You've been married for 3 years and haven't had a child. Why shouldn't my son find someone else? Lowering my head, I replied calmly, Of course he can, but he needs to agree to divorce me first. What did Henry's plans to marry Isabella have to do with me? The divorce agreement had already been signed. We just needed the official certificate. Too tired to argue further, I brushed off her accusations and returned to my room. On my way back, I passed Henry. He was wearing a crisp white shirt, looking as handsome and poised as ever, while having tea with Isabella on the terrace. She was wearing the diamond necklace he had just bought, and she poured coffee for him with a smile. As she leaned forward, the sunlight caught the necklace, making it sparkle brilliantly. The sight stirred something painful in me. Henry had always claimed to be too busy with work to spend time like this with me. Without lingering, I turned and returned to my room, my thoughts in disarray. I stared blankly at the documents in my hands, unable to focus. I had fallen for Henry at first sight, and that infatuation had trapped me for 3 years. But now, I finally realized that Henry had only been acting with me, while his sincerity was reserved for Isabella. I remained in that daze until Secretary Victoria came to deliver the asset inventory. "Madam," she said, "everything has been checked. Except for what was invested in the company, a few pieces of jewelry are missing." I looked up sharply. "Which ones?" She listed them, including a diamond necklace and a wedding dress. My heart sank as I recalled seeing that very necklace around Isabella's neck. I stormed into Isabella's room without hesitation. She was standing in front of a full-length mirror, wearing the wedding dress my mother had designed for me. Her wedding with Henry was set for 6 days from now. It all felt so rushed, and I guessed Henry had already arranged everything behind the scenes. But what shocked me the most was Isabella daring to wear my unique wedding dress. Fury surged through me, and I trembled as I rushed forward, grabbing the skirt of the dress. The delicate lace and pearl decorations tore off under my grip, scattering across the floor. I yanked the dress harder until the fabric gave way with a ripping sound. Isabella curled up in pain, forced to bend down, and stammered, "I'm sorry, I'll take it off right away." I held on to the wedding dress tightly, glaring at her coldly. She fell to the ground in front of the mirror, the dress now a mess with a large section of the skirt torn. Pearls and lace were strewn everywhere, and she looked utterly humiliated. With tears in her eyes, she said, "Miss Arya, if you wanted me to take it off, you could have just told me. Why did you have to use force?" I kept my expression icy and nudged her with my toe. "You stole my wedding dress and still dare to talk back?" She buried her head in her hands, crying like a fragile, wronged flower. Suddenly, hurried footsteps sounded behind me, and Henry burst into the room. He strode over, pushed me aside, and pulled Isabella into his arms. I stumbled back, catching myself by gripping the edge of the dressing table. The wedding dress slipped from my grasp and fell to the floor in tatters. Henry looked at me, his gaze filled with disgust and unfamiliarity, as if I were a stranger. "Arya, I told you I just wanted to make up for the regrets of the past. Why are you making things difficult for her?" he said coldly. A fire burned in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. After a long silence, I finally said, "That wedding dress was designed by my mother herself." His tone remained sharp. "It's just a piece of clothing. Would it have killed you to lend it to her for a few days? Instead, you tore it apart. Do you still think you're the proud eldest daughter of the Arya family? Enough is enough." I stood there, surrounded by the blooming flowers of the season, but all I felt was a bone-deep chill. Henry had always known how to hit me where it hurt, most. The wedding dress was beyond repair now. Isabella, still nestled in Henry's arms, frowned at the ruined dress with a look of disdain. Henry comforted her gently. "Don't worry. I'll order a new one right away to make sure it's ready in time for the wedding." I bent down, picked up the torn wedding dress, and left the room in silence. My chest felt as though it was being crushed, the pain almost unbearable. But I reminded myself that I only needed to endure for a few more days. Once the formalities were completed, I would be free. I had already converted most of my dowry jewelry and real estate into cash and stored it carefully. Henry barely acknowledged me, ignoring my presence all day. It wasn't until the evening that he came to my room. Standing in the doorway with his back to the light, his handsome face was cast in shadow. "Arya, your father has been transferred to the overseas branch and will leave in 3 days. Your mother is going with him," he said. I remained silent as he continued. "If you hadn't married me, you'd be nothing more than a down-and-out daughter of a wealthy family by now. I've already said that Isabella and I are just making up for past regrets. Your position as Mrs. Henry won't be shaken." I stayed quiet, knowing better than to respond. If only I hadn't fallen for him at first sight. If only my family had, allied with another influential family instead, I wouldn't be in this humiliating position now. Seeing my silence, Henry pulled a diamond ring from his pocket and slammed it onto the dressing table. "You lied to me and secretly sold this," he said, his voice heavy with anger. I met his burning gaze calmly. "I sold it because I didn't want it anymore. It's no big deal." His brows furrowed deeply. "The secretary told me you've been selling off a lot of your dowry lately," he said, his tone accusing. "You don't wear jewelry or entertain guests. What do you need so much money for?" I looked him in the eye and replied evenly, "My father is being transferred overseas. It's a long journey, and there are many expenses to cover." It was the truth, after all. Henry's expression darkened as he threw the items I had sold one by one onto the dressing table. The jewelry clattered loudly as it hit the surface. "All the things I gave you. Sold. Are you being petty with me, Arya?" Lowering my head, I calmly tidied up the necklaces and put them back into the jewelry box. With a quiet click, I closed the lid. I thought to myself that I'd just take the items abroad and sell them there, where Henry wouldn't have any control over them. I replied softly, "No, I'm not angry with you. I've already stopped caring about these things." Henry sneered. "Isabella is the one I should have spent my life with. You have no right to be jealous of her." Numbly, I said, "I know. Let's just get divorced." He repeated the same line he'd said countless times before. Isabella was his true love, and they were a perfect match. I was too tired to even react anymore. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. I continued folding my evening dresses, knowing I wouldn't have a need for such luxurious clothes after I left. Seeing how quiet I was, Henry's tone softened slightly. "Leave these things for the servants to handle," he said. I forced a faint smile and replied indifferently, "Okay." There were only 2 days left until Henry and Isabella's wedding. The villa was festively decorated, and even from my secluded room I could see the bright red banners through the window. On them was Henry's handwriting. "Hold your hand and grow old together with you. Hope to win someone's heart, and never part until our hair turns white." 3 years ago, when I married him, there had been none of this. As I gazed out the window, Isabella appeared at the end of the corridor. She was in high spirits today, her eyes curved into happy crescents, her steps light. The flowing skirt of her white wedding dress resembled a soft cloud. She stopped outside my room, her tone gentle, as she asked, "Miss Arya, what kind of necklace do you think I should choose for the wedding day?" She was still wearing the wedding dress she had tried on, her hair yet to be styled, looking like an innocent young girl. I replied coldly, "This isn't your first marriage. Shouldn't you already have experience? Why bother asking me on purpose?" Her expression froze, her face instantly pale. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Henry appeared from the corner of the corridor, his gaze sharp and cold. "Arya, you're a woman too. Why must you bring up the past to provoke her? Isabella came to you because she genuinely wanted to improve her relationship with you." I could see through Isabella's act. She was clearly showing off. But Henry? He couldn't see it. He only had eyes for her. Standing at the door, I looked down at her and said indifferently, "Just wear whatever necklace you like. I've answered you. You can leave now." Her eyes reddened, and she stumbled back a few steps, looking weak and helpless, as she leaned into Henry for support. Henry frowned and threatened, "Arya, don't push me. I can make your family's company unable to recover at any time." I stared at him, bitterness rising in my chest, but I managed a stiff smile and suddenly laughed tears welling up in my eyes. "Henry, you've already signed the divorce agreement," I said quietly. He sneered. If it weren't for the wedding being so close, I'd go get the divorce. My wounds still ached faintly. I remained silent for a moment, before nodding slightly to show I'd heard her. The assistant looked at me carefully and asked in a soft voice, "Madam, don't you have anything to say to General Manager Henry?" The cold night wind made my eyes sting. After a pause, I replied slowly, "No, you can leave and report back to him now." She quickly left. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. On the day of Henry's wedding, I rose early, just as the sky began to lighten. I changed into a simple, understated dress and put on sunglasses before leaving the villa. The butler still recognized me and casually asked, "Miss Arya, where are you going? The wedding will start in an hour." Isabella was about to become Mrs. Henry, and it was already a certainty that I was divorced from Henry. To distinguish between us, he addressed me by my full name. I simply smiled and replied, "I'm going to the airport to pick up my parents." "Don't tell Henry." He nodded and said, "Okay." I got into the car and drove toward the airport. The guests attending the wedding were all heading toward Henry's group villa, which was in the opposite direction of mine. I pulled down the sun visor and stared blankly at my toes. 3 years ago, when I married Henry, we had a brief period of mutual respect. At that time, I was naive and mistakenly believed that Isabella was already married. I thought that since he had chosen me, our marriage could last. I foolishly believed that if I gave him my sincere heart, he would reciprocate. Everything changed a year ago when Isabella suddenly contacted him. After marrying me, Henry's group experienced steady growth, and its market value multiplied several times. I loved him, and my father supported him, so his career flourished. He had a bright future, looking even more high-spirited than during his early business success. However, Isabella's life after marriage wasn't as smooth. Her husband kept a mistress, leaving her in constant pain. At just 25 years old, she was physically and emotionally drained, growing thinner day by day. Unable to bear it, she sought solace in Henry, her childhood sweetheart. Tearful calls and messages of love from her reopened the connection they once shared. Fate had played a cruel trick on them. She was supposed to be Henry's wife, and they were meant to go from school uniforms to wedding attire. Feeling guilty toward her, Henry resented me. From then on, he secretly supported her while growing distant from me. By the time I realized the truth, it was too late. An hour later, I boarded a plane to go abroad. My parents were aware of my divorce from Henry. They sighed in regret, lamenting that they had misjudged him and caused me so much pain. I pressed my lips together, unable to speak. It was my own naivety that led to mistake after mistake. After a 10-hour journey, we arrived at my parents' house abroad. Initially, I worried about adapting to the new environment, but I only fell ill for a few days due to jet lag. Soon, I adjusted. My mom planted flowers, grass, and fruit trees in the yard. The mild climate allowed everything to flourish. Although my dad's professional position was now more marginal, and much of his previous savings were frozen, life here felt relaxed and happy. I enjoyed fruits unavailable in China and took in scenery I'd never seen before. The sunshine and sea breeze refreshed me, and I gradually fell in love with this new life. Over time, the past faded from my memory. The moments I spent with Henry became blurred. Occasional tenderness, rare joys, lonely nights, and the weight of neglect. Everything drifted away like it belonged to another lifetime. One day, after attending a wedding for my dad's friends, "Son," my mom held my hand, frowned, and asked, "I saw you lost in thought just now. Were you thinking about him again?" I froze momentarily and answered honestly, I was thinking about how the steamed fish at the banquet was cooked. It tasted a bit different from yours." She burst into laughter. "I'll have your dad ask about it tomorrow," she said. I hugged her arm and playfully nuzzled against it. It was a harmonious, happy moment. The day before, Henry had sent a dress to Arya. It had been custom-made for her 2 months earlier. Every time he saw something delicate and beautiful, he would instinctively think of getting it for her. The light pink dress suited her perfectly, and he couldn't help but smile as he imagined how beautiful she would look wearing it. However, he didn't see Arya until the wedding began. His eyelids twitched with unease, and he asked the butler again, "Where's Madam?" The butler lowered his head, his voice trembling as he replied, "Madam went to the airport early this morning to see off Arya's father." It was time for the wedding, but Henry didn't care about Isabella standing behind him. He rushed into one of the guest rooms in the villa, pushing the door open. The room was spotless, unnervingly so, as though no one had ever lived there. The only thing left was that light pink dress lying quietly on the bed, untouched, and just as he had sent it. His heart sank into an abyss, and a sharp pain gripped his chest. She had truly left him. Without a second thought, Henry bolted to the garage, climbed into his sports car, and sped out through the gates, leaving the guests in shocked silence. Isabella stumbled after him, her wedding dress dragging along the ground, her makeup smeared by tears. "Henry, please don't go," she cried. He was supposed to be the groom, the center of attention at this wedding he had long awaited. Yet, she could only watch helplessly as his car vanished from sight. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed on the steps, overcome by despair. Thousands of miles away, Arya was now abroad, and Henry realized he might never see her again. Tears slipped through his fingers as he covered his face, his sobs piercingly sorrowful and heart-wrenching. Everyone nearby was startled by the scene, and his assistant rushed over in panic. "General Manager Henry, what's wrong?" But Henry couldn't speak. Behind him, above the villa, the fireworks that had been carefully prepared burst across the blue sky, painting it with vibrant colors. It should have been the happiest day of his life. But Arya was gone, and his mind was blank. Only then did he truly understand. Isabella had been nothing more than an unresolved obsession from his youth. For years, he had believed his marriage to Arya was a result of family pressure, that he should resent her, distance himself from her, and compensate Isabella. But after spending countless days and nights with Arya, he couldn't deny it anymore. He had fallen deeply in love with her. At that moment, he finally understood. Without Arya, his life was void of all meaning. I thought I would stay abroad for a long time, but 2 years later, my father was reappointed as vice president of the group. The company's internal crisis was resolved, and my father even won the lawsuit for the sexual harassment case. The scandal that had once tarnished his name disappeared overnight. It wasn't just my uncle who helped my father find the evidence. Henry had been involved as well. When my father mentioned Henry, his expression remained calm, devoid of any resentment. To Henry, my father was both a former father-in-law and a benefactor who had once offered him invaluable support. It made sense that Henry cared about my father's situation. In the spring, I returned to China with my parents. The villa we had once lived in had long since been auctioned off, so my father moved us to a new villa in the suburbs. The day Henry came to visit, a light drizzle fell from the sky. Holding a black umbrella, he stood silently in front of the door. The fine raindrops formed a curtain between us, like a layer of light gauze. I remembered the first time I saw him. He stood out from the crowd, with an extraordinary temperament. Back then, he seemed indistinct, like a rare and precious treasure. Over the years, he had lost a lot of weight, and the sharp edge he once carried had softened. Now, he resembled a deep, still pool of water, calm and without ripples. When I saw him again, My heartbeat remained steady, unmoved. Standing under the eaves, I slipped my hands into my pockets and lowered my head before asking, "What brings General Manager Henry here?" His voice was hoarse as he responded, "Arya, what I said about the divorce was just a moment of anger. I was upset because you sold all the gifts I gave you." I stared at him for a moment before replying slowly, "Henry, you've said such things twice now. The first time, I deceived myself and hid the divorce papers. The second time, I found the courage to go through with it." He frowned deeply, confusion flickering in his eyes. It seemed the memory of that time had slipped from his mind, lost in the haze of drunkenness. After all, it had been 2 years. I continued calmly. "When you were drunk, you said it was because of me that Isabella married someone else. You wrote the divorce agreement back then. 2 years ago, I took that agreement and left you. We're strangers now. If you want to talk business with my father, I can pass the message along." His face turned pale, his lips trembling as he struggled to speak in a low voice. "Arya, I came here specifically to find you. Since that's the case, there's nothing left to say." I stepped back and closed the door, shutting out everything outside. Later, the security guard told me that Henry had stood outside all night, only leaving when Isabella came to find him. 3 days after I returned to China, a friend in our circle hosted a charity auction. I accompanied a few familiar wives to the exhibition, and Isabella was there too. She stood apart from the crowd, looking gloomy, wearing minimal accessories, and huddled alone in the corner. No one paid her any attention. Back then, Henry had brought her home with great fanfare, making her involvement in our marriage public knowledge. It was no longer a secret that she had been the mistress who forced me to leave. Now, on such a formal occasion, she endured cold stares and whispers alone. I ignored her, focusing instead on the tiramisu in front of me. Elizabeth sat beside me, chattering. She went from being the wife of a playboy to the wife of a company executive. What more could she possibly want? After a brief pause, I replied, "Perhaps her expectations went beyond that." I handed Elizabeth a macaron, and she sat down to enjoy the afternoon tea with me. The aroma of desserts filled the air, adding a touch of warmth to the event. However, Elizabeth couldn't stay still. After a few bites, she ran off to take pictures. It was then that Isabella quietly approached me. Her tone was resentful as she said, "Arya, this is all your fault." I blinked, momentarily confused. Blame me again? While I was still young and healthy, I wasn't sure I could bear all the blame she wanted to pile on me. "If you hadn't married Henry back then, I could have been with him 5 years ago," she said bitterly. "I wouldn't have suffered so much, and he wouldn't still have you in his heart. We wouldn't have ended up like this, tired of each other." I pressed my temple, feeling a dull ache. "Why don't you blame him instead?" Her words faltered. For a moment, leaving her speechless, I continued. "When the family went bankrupt, Henry married me to turn the situation around. Even if he hadn't married me, he would have chosen someone else. He became the president of Henry Group at 27, a position most people could only dream of achieving in their lifetimes. Even his peers who graduated the same year still work for him now. If he truly wanted to marry you, nothing could have stopped him." I continued calmly. "When you were drunk, you said it was because of me that Isabella married someone else. You wrote the divorce agreement back then. 2 years ago, I took that agreement and left you. We're strangers now. If you want to talk business with my father, I can pass the message along." His face turned pale, his lips trembling as he struggled to speak in a low voice. "Arya, I came here specifically to find you." Since that's the case, there's nothing left to say. I stepped back and closed the door, shutting out everything outside. Later, the security guard told me that Henry had stood outside all night, only leaving when Isabella came to find him. 3 days after I returned to China, a friend in our circle hosted a charity auction. I accompanied a few familiar wives to the exhibition, and Isabella was there too. She stood apart from the crowd, looking gloomy, wearing minimal accessories, and huddled alone in the corner. No one paid her any attention. Back then, Henry had brought her home with great fanfare, making her involvement in our marriage public knowledge. It was no longer a secret that she had been the mistress who forced me to leave. Now, on such a formal occasion, she endured cold stares and whispers alone. I ignored her, focusing instead on the tiramisu in front of me. Elizabeth sat beside me, chattering. She went from being the wife of a playboy to the wife of a company executive. What more could she possibly want? After a brief pause, I replied, "Perhaps her expectations went beyond that." I handed Elizabeth a macaron, and she sat down to enjoy the afternoon tea with me. The aroma of desserts filled the air, adding a touch of warmth to the event. However, Elizabeth couldn't stay still. After a few bites, she ran off to take pictures. It was then that Isabella quietly approached me. Her tone was resentful as she said, "Arya, this is all your fault." I blinked, momentarily confused. Blame me again? While I was still young and healthy, I wasn't sure I could bear all the blame she wanted to pile on me. "If you hadn't married Henry back then, I could have been with him 5 years ago," she said bitterly. "I wouldn't have suffered so much, and he wouldn't still have you in his heart. We wouldn't have ended up like this, tired of each other." I pressed my temple, feeling a dull ache. "Why don't you blame him instead?" Her words faltered for a moment, leaving her speechless. I continued, "When the family went bankrupt, Henry married me to turn the situation around. Even if he hadn't married me, he would have chosen someone else. He became the president of Henry Group at 27, a position most people could only dream of achieving in their lifetimes. Even his peers who graduated the same year still work for him now. If he truly wanted to marry you, nothing could have stopped him. It wasn't me he couldn't let go of. It was fame and fortune. You should consider yourself lucky that he married someone as easygoing as me. If it had been someone else, when you first messaged Henry, they would have made your affair public." In truth, when Henry helped her escape her unhappy marriage, I was glad for her, relieved that she had finally freed herself from her suffering. But over time, I began to lose my fondness for her because, just like I once was, she was too kind, too naive. I finished speaking and set the dessert down, preparing to leave. Her eyes were red, and she stood by the flower bed, tears falling, steadily. That evening when I got home, Mom told me that several people had asked around about my marriage. I told her I had no intention of remarrying. I'd already been through it once, and there was nothing to gain from marriage. It only brings trouble. Managing the household, supporting your husband's career, considering children. If you don't marry the right person, you'll suffer. Being alone, on the other hand, is simple and carefree. Mom respected my decision and declined all matchmaking offers. I spent my days at home, helping Mom, and occasionally hanging out with friends. Life was peaceful and enjoyable. Henry often sent me gifts, luxury items, sometimes limited editions, sometimes long handwritten letters, but I returned everything to him untouched. Then one night, Isabella unexpectedly came to visit. She looked thinner, haggard, and worn out. Despite the cold outside, I let her in. She apologized tearfully. "I was so foolish back then. I'm sorry for what I did to you." I remained calm, handing her a tissue to wipe her tears. She explained that Henry had supported her financially, but didn't come home. She was alone in the mansion, ignored by everyone, feeling depressed. Back then, Henry hadn't kept his promise to marry her, and now he was ignoring her again. She sobbed, saying, I hate him so much. I propped my cheek up and listened, unsure of what to say. As long as she didn't direct her anger at me, I didn't mind listening. Isabella, it seemed, had been holding this in for a long time, and she poured out all her feelings to me. I was growing drowsy listening to her. Eventually, she hesitantly asked, "Can you forgive me? I took your husband away and made you sad. I really know I was wrong." After thinking for a moment, I replied, "I'll forgive you when you've repaired my wedding dress." 6 months later, Isabella returned my wedding dress. The torn lace had been replaced with a finer one, and the tiny pearls had been sewn back in, one by one. With help from others, all the damage had been repaired, making it as good as new. It looked lovely. At least during those 6 months of working on the dress, she wouldn't be too bored or preoccupied with whether Henry still loved her. During that time, 2 major things happened. First, the girl who had framed my father for sexual harassment was sentenced, and my father returned to his position as president. Second, due to a failed decision-making process, the board of directors unanimously decided to remove Henry as president, transferring him to the Southern branch. I wasn't surprised. He had risen too quickly in the business world and things had gone too smoothly for him. Eventually, he underestimated his rivals, lacked caution, and made mistakes. Before he left, he came to find me again, just like before. I stood on the marble steps of the mansion, looking down at him. He stood below, reserved, and looked up at me. "I'm going to California and might stay there for many years. Does this count as atonement?" I didn't want to hear it. "No, this is the result of your own poor decisions. It has nothing to do with me." I turned around and walked away. Isabella was about to follow Henry to the south. She was all alone, and I was the only one there to see her off. She sat in an ordinary commercial vehicle, rolled down the window, and looked at me. The light in her eyes was dim. I understood what she was worried about. The California branch was notorious for being a challenging place, and once someone went there, it was difficult to return. This departure carried an air of uncertainty about the future. I gently reassured her, "Don't worry too much. California is actually a nice place. The fruits there are amazing, delicious. Things you won't find in the north." She curved her lips into a smile, her warmth and radiance reminding me of how she had looked when we first met, but then tears slid from the corners of her eyes once more. "Thank you, Arya," she said softly. I stayed in North City, pursuing further education. I enrolled in an MBA program and also took up flower arrangement and oil painting. My father didn't remain in the head office indefinitely. Later, he volunteered to transfer to a branch office. I accompanied him, helping out while also experiencing life in various cities, taking in the vibrancy and prosperity of China. I no longer allowed myself to be caught up in trivial matters. Henry, too, made progress in California, achieving some success. However, we never crossed paths again. Several years later, I received a message from Isabella. She had spent 10 years married to Henry, but had finally decided to end their relationship. Unlike me, she didn't have a family to rely on and had depended entirely on Henry. Yet, she was always intelligent. Making use of the resources available to her through Henry, she quickly learned how to manage a business and built a career of her own. Eventually, she gathered the courage to break free from her past and begin an independent life. I thought that was admirable. Life stretches far ahead, and there's always an opportunity to start anew. If you like this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories like these only at StoryTimes.